Andy, thank you so much, and thank you for having me here. I'm sorry I'm not from the White House. As Andy mentioned, my name is Vicky Pillitteri. I work at the National Institute for Standards and Technology, and I'll be here talking a little bit about the Cybersecurity Framework that will be released this Thursday. So the National Institute of Standards and Technology is leading the coordination of a voluntary cybersecurity framework to reduce cyber risks based on existing industry standards, guidelines, and practices. Given the range of the entities that comprise the critical infrastructure, the framework is being designed to be relevant for critical infrastructure organizations of nearly every size and composition. As stated in the executive order, the cyber threat to critical infrastructure continues to grow and represents one of the most serious national security challenges we must confront. So this executive order introduces efforts focused on sharing of cybersecurity threat information and building a set of current, successful approaches, a framework, if you will, for reducing cyber risks to the critical infrastructure. Why NIST? We are a non-regulatory federal agency that provides an unbiased source of scientific data and practices. One of our core missions is to promote U.S. innovation and industrial competitiveness. And we have a long-standing history of successful partnerships with industry, other government agencies, and academia to address critical national issues. And since no one's used the joke so far, we're from the government and we're here to help. So the Cybersecurity Framework. The goal of the open process in developing the Cybersecurity Framework was to develop a robust technical basis to allow organizations to align this guidance with their existing organizational practices. The framework has been developed based on request for information responses, cross-country workshop discussions over the course of the last year, stakeholder engagement sessions, and ongoing feedback and dialogue with members of the critical infrastructure and cybersecurity communities. The Cybersecurity Framework, which will be released this Thursday, as Andy had mentioned, was truly built in collaboration with stakeholders from industry, both the users and owners of critical infrastructure and the innovators of the cybersecurity solutions. So a challenge that we faced during the last year was developing something that was really at the right level of detail for such a broad and diverse audiences of 16 very different critical infrastructures. The requirements that are most critical to, say, the financial sector may not be the same as those needed by the water sector. So looking at the second bullet on this slide, I think one of the challenges we saw was the requirement to develop a framework that's both prioritized, flexible, performance-based, and cost-effective sometimes seemed to be at odds with itself. So now you know a little bit about the challenge that we were faced. In the next couple of slides, I'll highlight the end result, the version 1.0 of the framework that will be released this Thursday. The framework, created through a collaboration between government and the private sector, uses a common language to address and manage cybersecurity risk in a cost-effective way based on the business needs without placing additional regulatory requirements on businesses. This framework focuses on using business drivers to guide cybersecurity activities and considering cybersecurity risks as part of an organization's risk management process. The framework provides a risk-based approach to managing cybersecurity risk and is composed of three main parts: the framework core, the framework implementation tiers, and the framework profiles. Each framework component reinforces the connection between business drivers and cybersecurity activities. So the three elements are listed there. The framework core is a set of cybersecurity activities, outcomes, and informative references that are common across critical infrastructure sectors, providing the detailed guidance for developing individual organizational profiles. Through the use of profiles, the framework will help the organization align its cybersecurity activities with its business requirements, risk tolerances, and resources. The tiers provide a mechanism for organizations to view and understand the characteristics of their approach to managing cybersecurity risk. So over the next few slides, I'll go into a little more detail on each of these three components. First, the framework core. The framework core is a set of cybersecurity activities, desired outcomes, and applicable references that are common across critical infrastructure sectors. The core represents industry standards, guidelines, and practices in a manner that allows for communication of cybersecurity activities and outcomes across the organization, from the executive level all the way down to the implementation and operations level. The core consists of 5 concurrent and continuous functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. When considered together, these functions provide a high-level, strategic view of the life cycle of an organization's management of their cybersecurity risk. The framework core then identifies underlying key categories and subcategories for each function and matches them with example informative references, such as existing standards, guidelines, and practices for each subcategory. These informative references are intended as an example or starting point and consist of cross-sector cybersecurity standards, requirements, and guidelines that were identified during the framework development process. For these mappings that will be published on Thursday, NIST worked very closely with those from industry and the respective SDOs, such as Eric Kosman from ISA 99 and the folks from the Automation Federation. So each of the categories and subcategories is really written to be outcome-focused to ensure that it's technology neutral and implementation friendly. Next, the framework implementation tiers. The framework implementation tiers provide context on how an organization views cybersecurity risk and the process in place to manage that risk. The tiers describe the degree to which an organization's cybersecurity risk management practices exhibit the characteristics defined in the framework. For example, risk and threat aware, repeatable, adaptive. The tiers characterize an organization's practices over a range from partial to adaptive. These tiers reflect a progression from informal, reactive responses to approaches that are agile and risk-informed. During this tier selection process, an organization should consider its risk management practices, threat environment, legal and regulatory requirements, business and mission objectives, and organizational constraints. The framework profile. A framework profile represents the outcomes based on business needs that an organization has selected from the framework categories and subcategories. The profile can be characterized as an alignment of standards, guidelines, and practices into the framework core in a particular implementation scenario. Profiles can be used to identify opportunities for improving cybersecurity posture by comparing a current profile, the as-is state, if you will, to a target profile, the to-be state. To develop a profile, an organization can review all of the categories and subcategories of the framework, and based on the business drivers and a risk assessment, determine which are most important. They can add categories and subcategories as needed to address the organization's unique risks. The current profile can be used to support prioritization and measurement of progress towards the target profile, while factoring in other business needs, including cost effectiveness and innovation. Profiles can be used to conduct self-assessments and communicate within an organization or even between organizations. So now that you know a little bit of what the framework contains, here's the big part. How do you use this thing? An organization can use the framework as a key part of its systemic processes for identifying, assessing, and managing cybersecurity risk. The framework's not designed or intended to replace existing processes, and an organization can use its existing processes and overlay it into the framework to determine gaps in its current cybersecurity risk approach and even develop a roadmap to improvement. Utilizing the framework as a cybersecurity risk management tool, an organization can determine activities that are most important to the critical service delivery and prioritize expenditures to maximize the impact of the investment. This framework can also be leveraged to establish or improve a cybersecurity program. It can be used as a tool to prioritize and scope, create a current profile, conduct a risk assessment, create a target profile, determine, analyze, and prioritize gaps, and implement an action plan. It also provides a common language to communicate requirements among interdependent stakeholders responsible for the delivery of essential critical infrastructure services. An example of this could be an organization may use a target profile to express cybersecurity risk management requirements to an external service provider, say like a cloud provider. Finally, the framework can be used to identify opportunities for new or revised standards, guidelines, or practices where additional informative references would help organizations address emerging needs. So a good example of this is as the ISA 99 IEC 62443 work continues to evolve and they finalize more standards, they could be leveraged and mapped into as additional informative references. So as mentioned in the mid-January status update that we posted, while many stakeholders see the value in guidance relating to privacy, there are many comments that stated a concern that the methodology posted in the preliminary cybersecurity framework did not reflect consensus private sector practices and therefore might limit the use of the framework for this purpose. Many of the commenters also stated their belief that privacy considerations should be fully integrated into the framework core. Several commenters expressed support for an alternative methodology proposed by stakeholders and discussed publicly at the 5th NIST Framework Workshop in November. So in response to these concerns, NIST has incorporated the alternative methodology for privacy into the How to Use section of the final framework, with additional context on privacy derived from comments and ongoing public input. This will allow organizations to better improve general privacy principles when implementing a cybersecurity program. And of course, NIST will continue to consider privacy standards and best practices as an area of focus for future work and in the next version of the framework. Cybersecurity Framework adoption. Also, a hot topic at the November Cybersecurity Framework Workshop was adoption. Several participants raised issues of what adoption of the framework means, how it would be gauged, and whether or not specific steps would be needed to be taken and confirmed in order for an organization to be considered as having adopted the framework. So NIST and DHS together put together this working definition of cybersecurity framework adoption, and I can only assume it will continue to evolve as the DHS voluntary program grows and builds. So as directed by the executive order, the Department of Homeland Security is partnering with the critical infrastructure community to establish a voluntary program to support increased security and resilience of the nation's cyber infrastructure through the use of the cybersecurity framework. This voluntary program will be the coordination point within the federal government for critical infrastructure owners and operators interested in improving their cyber risk management processes. The goals of the voluntary program are twofold: to support industry in increasing cyber resilience and increase awareness and use of the cybersecurity framework to support the first goal. To advance these goals, the program will be very flexible, allowing organizations to participate in voluntary program in multiple ways. So to work with organizations interested in the voluntary program, DHS will leverage its current national critical infrastructure security and resilience efforts, building off long-standing partnerships and processes developed with industry. The voluntary program will coordinate additional cybersecurity framework outreach activities through partnership with sector-specific agencies, sector coordinating councils, and other industry partners. So if you have specific questions or are interested in participating in the voluntary program, please reach out to DHS. They will be more than happy to welcome you. Finally, next steps. So industry stakeholders have volunteered their time and expertise to the framework development process through participation in the workshops, responding to formal comment submissions, and other engagements. NIST will continue to support the use of the framework as it is put into practice, ensuring that the owners and operators of critical infrastructure can rely on a diverse market of products and services to help meet their cybersecurity needs. On February 13th, NIST expects to publish the Cybersecurity Framework version 1.0. As the framework has always been intended to be a living document, there will be a need for update and to refine the framework based on lessons learned through the use, as well as integration of new standards, guidelines, and practices as they come available. NIST intends to continue to serve as the convener of this process until the document can be transitioned to a non-government organization. This will assure that the momentum that has been generated to date will continue and that the framework advances steadily and addresses key areas that need further development. Over the past few months, many stakeholders have suggested it would be beneficial for NIST to develop and share a roadmap and path forward after the framework release, building off the areas of improvement section that was included in the preliminary framework. NIST is developing such a roadmap that will include areas for further development and harmonization. Some of these areas include authentication, automated indicator sharing, conformity assessment, cybersecurity workforce, data analytics, international aspects, privacy standards, and supply chain risk management. Several of these topics may be addressed in focused workshops and meetings over the next few months. More broadly, NIST is considering sponsoring a workshop in the 4 to 6 month timeframe to review stakeholder experience with version 1.0, progress with implementing the roadmap, and questions around long-term governance. So the framework, again, will be posted on Thursday. It will be announced in the Federal Register and available on the NIST website, nist.gov/cyberframework. So thank you very much for having me here, and I look forward to speaking with many of you during the course of this conference.